Welcome everybody to the third of our 3 African swine fever webinars. My name is Ross Cutler and I'm chairing this afternoon's session. I would like to thank right up front the Victorian Farmers Federation, Australian Pork Limited and Agriculture Victoria who are sponsoring this project. In particular, Agriculture Victoria is sponsoring the project through enhancing biosecurity and animal welfare delivered by the VFF. In addition, it's my pleasure to thank, through the VFF, Kelly Quayle, Laurie Mannix and Tim Kingma, through Australian Pork Limited, Margot Andre and Lachelle Van Breda, through Agriculture Victoria, Cameron Bell and David Chapness, and through Apium, Dr. Chris Richards. Now, please remember to ask and enter any questions in your question dialog box, and we will try to get to them at the end of the session. Today's presentation, Outbreak Preparedness and Response, is by Dr. Regina Fogarty. Regina is a pig vet with over 30 years experience in both public and private sectors. Recently, she commenced work with Agriculture Victoria as Principal Veterinary Officer Pigs at Epsom in the Chief Veterinary Officer's Unit, in a role I once held in 1981. She spent the previous years as a veterinarian with Reveille, looking after their Victorian units. Before then, Regina worked for the New South Wales DPI, initially as a specialist pig veterinarian in a statewide role, and then more broadly managing at a very senior level animal welfare, extension and research delivery, together with agricultural policy. She is currently the Secretary of the Australian Pig Veterinarians and is the scientific coordinator for their annual conference. Regina has contributed very positively to Australia's control of African swine fever and in biosecurity roles for Australian Pork Limited. Regina.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the VFF for organising these webinars. Okay, the background to this talk, if you had a chance to listen to the previous sessions, you'll see they set the scene. David Williams did an excellent introduction and gave us an overview of what the virus has been doing and how it appears when it infects pigs. This is an incredibly deadly virus of pigs, and we cannot live with it in our industry. I think all around the world, that's the way the commercial sector is seeing it. One troublesome issue is that while infected pigs are very sick or even dead, found dead, as a sick or a dead pig, they're not remarkable and they don't scream ASF. Now, if the disease reliably spread really quickly across the herd, such as you would expect with influenza or FMD, then you might pick it up quickly. But this one can spread very slowly to in-contact pigs over a period of a few weeks before it starts to stand out. And by then, you're likely to have moved pigs off-site or had visitors on-site, and it may have already spread. So keep a close eye on any unusually sick or dead pigs. It will kill pigs of all age groups and cause abortions in sows. Then Chris Richards and Bree gave an excellent overview of biosecurity last week. A couple of key points I picked up. Chris said that we need to continually review and work to improve our farm biosecurity in practice. Both speakers gave excellent examples and pointed to areas of weakness in Australian biosecurity systems. Both Chris and Bree warned that if ASF does get into Australia, then all farms are really going to have to step up biosecurity procedures. So very timely warning. Okay, so everyone will know what this is. It's the Emergency Disease Hotline, and I hope everyone has it in their phone. I have it in one of my phones as the horrible hotline, and on the other phone I have it as the hotline, so there's no way I can't find it if I'm looking for it. It is actually the only hotline I have in my phones, and certainly the most important one. Now, in the last few weeks, Ag Victoria has been involved in exclusion exercises, mainly just very early stage exercises for foot and mouth and for ASF, and they were negative and resolved quickly. The system is there to support you and your enterprise, so please do not hesitate to use it. Just moving on to the next slide, sorry. Okay, so what I wanted to do in this talk was really, I can work out where the mouse is gone, which I can't do. There it is, sorry. That's weird. No. Okay, what I really wanted to do, is focus on what does responding to an ASF incursion look like from the farm. Okay, so back to ASF, where are we likely to see it pop up? Basically, anywhere there's pigs, it needs pigs. It might get into these populations from different sources, but they are all a high risk to our industry. And what are we in Australia planning to do about it? There are a series of national response policies for human, plant and animal health. COVID, of course, has been a work in progress and is still under development. But with ASF and most of the major exotic animal diseases, we know a lot about the diseases and we've been working on these plans for quite a long time. Our planning is based on containing, controlling and eradicating the disease, with the option that if eradication is not deemed possible, that the program changes to contain and control only or a transition to management. And that is a decision that is made by the government and the industry together, because government and industry are sharing the costs. With ASF, the costs are shared 50-50, government and industry. So industry pays 50%, the federal government pays 25%, and the states share that remaining 25%. And those costs are actually, the money is paid out during the operation, the federal government carries that cost, and then the actual costs are then resolved after the operation. So it's a fairly well designed system that is, which a lot of other countries don't have systems as good as that. Okay, so these are the general principles for emergency animal disease, which you'll find in specific AUSVET plans. The slide lists the overarching principles. When we have this disease in our domestic pigs, we would not have access to international trade, and that's why it's such an important disease. Okay, the plan is based on the quaintly named policy of stamping out. I sort of loved that term ever since I first heard it. So it's a program to stamp out the last vestige of the infection. And the program itself has a number of key features. Firstly, we quarantine places we know or believe have infected animals or where the virus is present. The other wide-reaching program we put in place is movement controls. You may have heard talk of the national stock standstill, where the government immediately stops all susceptible animals from moving on roads. It's not part of Australia's plan for African swine fever, but it is for ASF, is for foot and mouth. So don't think about it in terms of this disease. But the states will still impose movement controls, and those will be based on 3 area statuses. We'll be declaring restricted areas, they'll be within 3 kilometres of infected properties, control area, 10 kilometres, and then the outside area. So the whole country will be divided up into restricted, control and outside areas. Basically, lines drawn on maps. The area status will change with time. Say the disease is found in Bendigo. Victoria is likely to put in place a restricted area around the infected properties and declare our whole state a control area for the period of time when we make sure there's no trace back to other properties or surveillance indicates there are no sites of further infection across the state. Tracing involves trace backwards and trace forwards from the time of suspected earliest infection to all properties where there's a high risk of movement. Surveillance is looking for active disease on farms, and this may require producers to supply information on daily farm health status, mortality rates, etc., through to sample collection and testing and or a visit by an official government veterinary officer to check the status of the health of the pigs. The 3 Ds, as we now call destruction, disposal and decontamination, cover the 3 major steps to eliminate a farm as a source of infected pigs or materials. In the meantime, our national approach to ASF provides for compensation paid by the control program to cover the value of the animals, products, and any other materials that are destroyed in the process of destruction, disposal, and decontamination. The concept of proof of freedom relates to both dealing with an individual infected property, which needs to be declared free, and then nationally we have a status of proof of freedom. Generally with ASF, proof of freedom takes 3 months on a farm after the end of the final decontamination or the final disinfection, the end of the Stamping Out program. So it's a fairly long downtime. That requires evidence. It's not just a time-based thing. Zoning and compartmentalisation are concepts applied to free up trade or movements, but only if the disease can be demonstrated to be clearly restricted to certain parts of a country. So Belgium, even though it's part of the country of the EU, has been declared a zone, and it has infection in its feral pigs, but not in its domestic pigs. Currently, Western Australia is looking to see if it could be zoned free in an outbreak scenario, and there's obvious geographical reasons why that's possible. Okay, next slide. So that's the general thing, but what does it mean to a pig farmer? And sadly, in all these government things, we always say, it depends. Well, it depends on where the disease is and where the pig farm is. So it could turn up on your farm, in your district, somewhere in Victoria, on a farm in another state, in feral pigs, on my farm in the district, or feral pigs a long way away. Just like COVID, but unlike COVID, the states have a mutual obligation to follow the same rules through the AUSVETPLAN. And with our national industry, we rely upon that. So let's just go through those scenarios and how farms will be affected. So in this diagram here, the two little red dots, if you can actually see them, are infected farms on a map. The area around them within the orange line is called the restricted area, and that's a line drawn basically 3 kilometres from the property. If another farm gets infected nearby, then we tend to expand the area of the restricted area so that we can have one organisational group working on control in that area. The area outside the restricted area is the control area. That can be 10 kilometres sort of following the line of the RA, 10 kilometres from all infected properties basically. And outside that, there's another line, and that line takes you to the outside area. Okay, so let's go on to ASF suspected on my farm. So whether you as a farmer first raises the alert to the disease on farm, or your veterinarian does, our priority is for either a private vet or a government vet to visit the farm to collect samples that will hopefully exclude the emergency animal disease. And in Victoria, as I said, we regularly have exclusions. Even before the disease officially gets confirmed, and that relies on laboratory diagnosis from the National Laboratory at Geelong, if the government has a strong suspicion, we may put in place effective quarantine arrangements and start planning for a stamping out operation before it's even called. So speed is of the essence, but planning is critical. Critically, we also want to stop the spread and work out if it already has spread off your farm. So there's a whole heap of information that is needed to be fed into that project. The government officer working on the case will want to get started as soon as possible. Now in Victoria, a farmer is not charged with undertaking the stamping out operations. The government takes on that role. If the decision is undertaken to carry on the stamping out activity, an operational manager will be appointed to manage and plan those tasks. So there are two major information gathering tasks that need advice from the farm. Importantly, we need to work out how it got onto the farm and when and what was that first case. Now sadly, the case being confirmed is rarely the first one. Farm mortality records and treatment records for the previous weeks will be useful to follow the disease back and try and determine when that first case was seen on farm. Once we get that date, then we need to look at all movements onto the property in the 30 days prior to that first case to see if we can pin down how the virus was introduced. We start with pig movements in that case, and then we move on to people movements, feed trucks, etc. To establish an infection, a pig has to have eaten or had in its mouth contaminated food or had nose contact with an infected pig or a contaminated material. Remember David's talk on 2 weeks ago on ASF. The virus is found and excreted in feces, urine, nasal and oral secretions, carcass tissue, blood, and aborted materials. So movement records, visitor records, feed truck records will all be needed. Other critical question we have to look at is we need to ask as to how confident we can be that feral pigs have not been the source. We also need to work out, could it have spread from that first infection? So records of all pig movements off the farm since that introductory period, truck movements, staff and visitors. We need a property map so we can identify entry and exit points as part of the quarantine procedure and part of the operational procedure. So we can establish a map of the work, so we can exclude houses and impacts on other farm operations where possible. So there's a lot of information, and much of it farmers will have in their farm records. The names and contact lists and home addresses for all staff and visitors, visitor logs, contractors doing maintenance work, the guy who came onto the property to check the power lines for the power company, etc. Anyone who's been on the farm potentially for the last couple of months. The easier this stuff is to pull out of your records, the faster the tracing team can get on to following up on the next step, the critical trace forward to see where the virus may have already spread. Tracing information will be followed up to identify properties and contacts that will need to be investigated prior to being cleared of suspicion. That's a massive task that, of course, will happen off your farm, but your farm will provide the basis for that information. So if we look at stamping out actually on a farm, keep losing my mouse. Okay, a site action plan is developed, anticipating stamping out. We're developing a plan for the destruction, disposal, and decontamination effectively. This sort of information we need is a floor plan of the area, what numbers, ages, and weight of the pigs, operational and no-go areas, the volumes of feed on farm, potential sites for carcass disposal on farm, any advice on killing of the animals. I don't mean advice on how you'd kill animals. I mean advice on your farm. If we have to move pigs out of sheds, because it's an awful lot easier to move dead animals when they're not in sheds, as all pig farmers know, advice on how to get the pigs out of the sheds and where we might make some straw yards, etc. the pigs could be waiting in. There's a lot of stuff that the farm manager and the farm staff can actually provide a lot of really useful information on these operations. If there's any gear on the site that could be used in the 3D program. Cost of all that stuff could be compensated for. Any staff or contractors you may have that could be engaged in any part of the operation. Now, we certainly wouldn't be expecting farm staff to be killing pigs unless they're willing to do so. But there may be the cleanup operations that they could continue to be working in and actually be engaged and employed in over the life of the operation. Feral animals and rodents always come up. And of course, just the basic things like where's the power, what the water supplies, the drainage, farm machinery, availability of straw bales, etc. to create walkways where you can actually move animals outside sheds. So there's an awful lot that can be done. So the government office is going to be developing that plan and then carrying it out. Okay, so each site is different and each will present unique challenges for the approach. Basically, this work is resourced through the State Emergency Management Group, and it's overseen under this animal disease emergency and by Agriculture Victoria. And we've been looking at all sorts of options for how we go about this work. So there's options for destruction. So whether it's blunt trauma, these are the basic options: blunt trauma, carbon dioxide gas for small pigs, captive bolts and rifles for larger pigs. The options for disposal largely hang around on-site burial or off-site landfill. There are other options, but these are the favoured options that we've been looking at. The options are decontamination. So the process is an initial disinfection, removal of items that cannot be cleaned, cleaning with detergents and high-pressure water, drying and disinfecting. That will involve agency staff and private contractors on site. So there'll be potentially some road work as we build roads to actually take trucks, vehicle cleaning sites, showering, toilet facilities, car parking. It's a 24-hour site operation that we're trying to undertake as fast as possible. One thing that always to be aware of is media intrusion, and certainly the government will play a role in trying to manage that. But as farmers, you're going to have to manage a bit of that yourself, just because they'll be approaching you any way they can. And of course, then there's that proof of freedom stage, which involves basically, it may involve putting some susceptible animals, some pigs, onto the farm between that final disinfection and the 3-month period, and seeing whether they get infected. There could be a range of activities that's undertaken there. So, the stamping out, the 3D work, is the truly horrible part that we see lots of pictures of, and we look at other cases, other examples. And it's a really big task. Depending on any farm, it's a big task because the emotion tied up in the farm and the animals and is enormous, as it should be. Okay, so there's plenty of resources out there at this stage, for you as farmers. So Agriculture Victoria has a website which particularly has information on the disease. Australian Pork Limited has a lot of good information. This little brochure here is one about preparing a business to survive an emergency animal disease. Goes through a lot of the sorts of information that you need to be thinking about and putting together and planning for, so you can survive the EAD experience, particularly when there's an EAD on your farm. So have a look at those various websites. And if you're certainly after any information, contact a local veterinary officer or a government officer, or myself, and we'll be very pleased to help. Okay, now I want to run through the scenarios and how they'll affect other locations. So we've just quickly gone through the worst location, the farm that's infected. But as I said, there's a lot of other locations that will be affected by this disease. If we get it in Victoria, if we get it anywhere in the country. Oops, going away. Okay, so the control program uses many of the same principles as we see with COVID, but with tighter controls. Basically, wherever we draw a control line on a map, there are likely to be some restrictions on movement over that line. Obviously, that includes live pig movements, carcass material, including placentas and stillborns. Some people don't move any of that stuff off their farm routinely, but some farms do. Piggery, waste and effluent. Again, many farms don't move waste and effluent off farm, but some do. And it also includes, these movement controls also include some considerations for feed and for bedding, particularly if you're bringing bedding into the farm, and that bedding is going to be in contact with pigs. The basic tools involve designating the status of pig holding properties and defining what movements can occur. To contain disease, not all movements, business as usual, can occur, and they won't be approved. So in the early days, we're thinking of looking at a week or a 10-day period so we can get a hand of restricting movements, so we can get a handle on where the disease may be. Because as I said earlier, this disease is not going to show up quickly. It's going to take a while to appear. So we have to give ourselves that time to slow down movement and keep looking for disease so we can actually find out where it is. We really don't want to have it spreading willy-nilly across the state in the first 2 weeks. So as I said, most likely this whole state will be declared a control area and pigs will not be allowed to move to market. So all producers need to be planning for that and thinking of the longer-term restrictions and their implications on their farm business. If you're located in that closer restricted area, then expect movement controls to be even more limiting and on-farm surveillance to be more rigorous. Generally, farms might be asked to provide data on mortalities, but if you're in that restricted area, 3 kilometres from an infected property, then you might get a farm visit. While the system is designed to be flexible to cater for changes in circumstances, operationally, it is rigid and it is legal. Now, this is a national approach with nationally applied rules, and we're relying upon the other states, just as they're relying upon us, to deliver the program. In the early days, and we're thinking the next week, as we put together, let's work out together what properties have suspicious disease, there are direct controls from the known infected properties. I've just lost my plot here. In the early days, and we're thinking to the next week, as we work out whether other properties have suspicious disease and there are direct contacts from the known infected properties, or we trace movements from an infected property, it is most likely that the whole state will be declared a control area and pigs will not be allowed to move at all. So that's property to property as well as property to abattoir. Once we have a good idea where the disease is and it's not spreading, we can open up essential movements under permits. And a permit may require a simple application online where you provide contact details and assurances. In other cases, the risk assessment may require more details and discussions with a permits officer. Surveillance may involve providing weekly data on mortality rates and immediate reporting and further investigation on any suspicion of disease. You're also going to need to be able to decontaminate vehicles leaving your property. So there's a number of things you have to gear yourself up for before this outbreak happens. It needs consideration. Okay, so what's needed in permits? Just go. Oops. As I said, this is just a guide for applying for permits, and this is the type of information required. But you may also need to provide a declaration that you meet industry minimum biosecurity standards. So not just providing information on where you're going, what you're doing, but things about your operation. You may be required to move directly to slaughter and not stop. Trucks going to slaughter may only be able to take a single consignment. You can't go to another farm and pick up another load. There's all sorts of movement controls that are designed to limit the ability of that movement to spread disease. Okay, so let's just say the ASF's in another state. So the early controls, they're going to be similar to the previous slide while we determine if there's been any spread to Victoria. So I'm not going to make these calls, that's not my job, but I wouldn't be surprised if we had an outbreak, say, in New South Wales, and we know perhaps those pigs travelled through Victoria to go to slaughter in DVP, then it's probably likely that we'll be concerned it may have spread into Victoria, and so we may actually have a restriction on movements in a control area in Victoria. Once we get through that early period, we can then hopefully, and the disease never enters Victoria, we can move to an outside area status. Now, the movements in our industry are still complex, and they're market driven. So you might find that travelling back to Victoria from a property in either an RA or a CA in another state will still have specific movement conditions. So say someone was taking pigs, say we had the disease in South Australia and someone was taking pigs from Victoria into South Australia for slaughter, then coming back, you might find there's some movement restrictions on those trucks. Maybe not so much going one way, but coming back. So it is complex. If we all just lived in our own little states, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Okay. Okay, the next one is, oh, it's not going that way. Sorry, there's too many slides. So if ASF is found in feral pigs on someone's farm or in the district, then looking at this slide, the stuff in red is what really happens with the feral pigs, and the stuff in black is what really happens with the domestic pigs on farm. So with feral pigs, there's been consideration of how they'll handle this, is that there'd be a declaration of infected zone, because it's not really, it's not really a farm. It hasn't got a line on a map, as we know. There's no border. So it'll be trying to create a buffer and a treatment area based on local understanding of feral pigs' home ranges. So we have an infected zone, and the minimum size of that infected area would represent the expected estimated time the disease has been present. The basic starting point is they reckon that pigs would perhaps move 3 kilometres in 1 month. So if it's presumed to be a couple of months since this disease has been detected, it's been a couple of months since it started, then there might be a 6 kilometre zone around that infected area. Recreational hunting will be banned in the infected area and in the restricted area to limit dispersal of feral pigs. Obviously, there'd be a program of surveillance and tracing. There'd be movement controls on recreational hunters, and would be fairly locality-specific plans on eradication. I know almost nothing about how they go about that, but there's a team of people working in the feral pig area that are working on that now. Again, like Belgium, it could have immediate impact on international trade if we found ASF in our feral pigs, even if we couldn't find it in our domestic pigs. So if you're on a farm in this area, we'll need to do ongoing surveillance of your domestic pigs to keep excluding ASF, to keep making sure that it's not getting in there. We'd be trying to reinforce separation from domestic pigs, whether it's through fencing, tidying up farms like removing feed spills, increased surveillance, etc. We're trying to minimise the risk of spread through decontamination of vehicles, equipment and people, because feral pigs could be passing and could have infected material on the ground, on roads, etc. So it's a different job, but it's still the same pressure on the landholder to try and keep the level of disease down and away from the domestic pigs. Okay. So if we found feral pigs somewhere in Victoria, or say in Western Australia, I don't mean particularly Western Australia, but somewhere a fair way away, again, there'd be the same thing. There'd be a declaration of the infected zone based on the local understanding of home ranges, and that I understand varies a lot with where the pigs are. There'd be a program of national surveillance and tracing. Movement controls, again, on recreational hunters. One of the theories is you don't want to go shooting feral pigs at the site because you may disperse them, drive them away. Again, there'd be direct development of locality-specific plans on eradication and an immediate impact on international trade. So we'd be doing more ongoing surveillance of domestic pigs on farms, reinforcing those separation distances. And as we know, if it becomes widespread in the feral pigs, if we cannot eradicate it, there's a plan we may have to live within ferals, and that may change the way we operate operate our farms, particularly in terms of biosecurity. Let's hope it never comes to it. So, what should I do? Can I do to be prepared to prevent disease incursion? The basic points are: we need to develop, review, and implement farm biosecurity plans. You've heard them talked about before. And sound biosecurity is part of that. We need to monitor the health and report suspect unusual disease to your vet or to the hotline. And as farmers, you need to prepare your businesses to survive, because that's the critical thing here. We want an industry. And that's the end of the presentation, basically. Finished very early.
Thank you, Regina. We have a few minutes for a few questions. And while I'm waiting for something to pop up on my question list, I have a couple of questions, Regina. Let's say I have 100 sows on a farm in the control area. When can I send my pigs to the abattoir? I understand there may be a standstill for a few days, but is there anything that I can do to ensure that as soon as a statewide standstill is lifted, that I can get a permit and move pigs? How long am I likely to have to keep the pigs on my farm? How many days or weeks should I prepare for, and what can I do to speed up that process?
There's probably not a lot you can individually do to speed up that process, but there's going to be some requirements on you to allow you to move pigs, and they'll probably be requirements that you need to be discussing with your pig carter if you don't move the pigs yourselves. So as I said, there could be no movements, and for up to a week. So you need to work out how you're going to, maybe 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks. You're going to need to work out how you can manage those extra pigs on farm, and then plan for how you can get them off and what's the smartest way to get them to market. Permits will be probably initially available online, and I went through I put a slide up with some of the questions that you're going to be asked, but there'll be some things that relate to that that you can think about and you can start planning for. So if you're a smaller farm and you actually say on a milk run where people pick up pigs from a couple of farms, you need to have a way to not to do that, because you won't be allowed to have milk runs. So they'll need to go straight to slaughter. There'll be no stopping. Certainly no travelling on highways will be required. You'd need to keep an eye on the pigs, and you need to declare there's no signs of disease on farm. So you need to be confident about that. Vehicles would need to have clearance and disinfection, particularly as they leave the abattoirs. But you'd sort of want to make sure that nothing coming to your farm had any evidence of any dirt on it, and it had been disinfected before it arrived there. If you were having to move your pigs interstate to go to slaughter, there may be extra conditions required by that jurisdiction. What we're hoping, because we haven't sort of dealt with this yet, is we're hoping that we can put all those requirements into one application so that the farmer doesn't have to deal with multiple jurisdictions. But one of the things we're most likely to have to do is be able to declare that you meet minimum biosecurity standards. And currently, those standards are based around either the APIC standards or the standards available on the Animal Health Australia biosecurity forgotten what it's called, guidelines or something. So there's a couple of different standards you may need to meet, because there will be, I understand, there will be a requirement to say I meet minimum biosecurity standards, but both for you and for the place you're moving pigs to. So it's it's not going to be business as usual. I think that's the basic message. There'll be a lot of extra paperwork, a requirement to report, thinking about how you're moving the animals, and making some declarations about the status, the health status of the pigs the day they move, and the days leading up to the day they move, and the the biosecurity status of the farm. And as I said, you'll need to work with the truck, the pig transporter, to make sure that you can cover all those requirements in terms of routes, number of pigs being carted, etc. So it's it's going to be a big change, for all farms, from big farms down to little farms. People that may only move pigs once a month still could be caught up in this if they manage to hit the wrong weeks. But it's one thing that the industry has to prepare for, is that holding pigs longer on farms. So you need to know, you've got the feed to do that. Have you got water supplies? You've got space? How are you going to manage all that? That's a critical part of it. Thanks, Ross, for that question. I mean, it's a really confronting part of this whole thing. It's not just the farms that are infected; it's the farms that are in the same area or in the same district or in the same state or even nationally. So, it's possible, if we really don't know where the disease is when it's first found, we don't understand where it could have spread to, all farms in Australia could be doing effectively the same thing, closing down movements for a period of time. And that's a really big ask on the industry, and that's why it needs planning now to make sure we can do it.
Well, thank you, Regina. At the risk of labouring the issue, let's just say that I'm in a restricted area and I want to send my pigs 10 k's down the road to my own grow out. So these are pigs that I'm moving at, say, weaning, to a grow out site 10 k's down the road. Is the same thing going to apply? Is it exactly the same?
Not exactly the same, but initially it would be the same. Initially, that not moving. I mean, in a way, we're not calling it a stock standstill, but it's very similar. It's likely to be very similar, because we'll be very concerned that we don't know where this disease is, and we'll be very concerned that we spread it with any movements. So possibly more likely you'll have your own truck in that circumstance. So you're the truck owner, and you'll need to have an ability to keep the trucks clean and disinfected. But it may still take some time before you get permission to move pigs. Hopefully not too long, because it's a balance between certainty the disease hasn't spread and business continuity for farms. So, but that is the plan, that we won't be moving pigs anywhere for a short period of time. And there are anticipated to be some issues to do with how, when you move pigs to another one of your enterprise sites, there may be some extra surveillance required on those pigs once they arrive, and no mixing of those pigs with other pigs. And all those things are quite, they can be quite difficult on some sites, but that's the level of concern that we have, that this disease may be hard to pick up in the early days, and it may spread.
So almost best case, producers have to have a look around their site and see where they might be able to store at least a week's worth of pigs.
Yes, that seems to be the case, Ross. And so whether it's weaners coming out of a farrowing shed, or whether it's growers that we're going to go to a finisher site, or whether it's finishers going off to market, cull sows that are supposed to be going next week, we have to find ways to store all those pigs on farm for at least a week. I think that's an expectation that's been placed on industry by government. We assume you can do that, sadly. It may be easier on a lot of other enterprises and difficult on the pig industry, but that's the sort of assumption that we're thinking about.
And to continue, given that a minimum biosecurity standard has to be met, it could be that for farms that are unable to meet that minimum standard, that they may indeed have to hold their pigs for a little bit longer, possibly 2 or 3 weeks, until the safety of the state or national herd can be assured or protected.
Yeah, that's what I'm reading into it, Ross. When I see what's been drafted, that's definitely how you have to read it. That not being able to meet minimum biosecurity standards may be an issue that makes life much more difficult for pig producers over those that can demonstrate them anyhow. Yeah, so it's not having the disease on your farm is still a problem if we get it in this country, or if we get it in feral pigs. It's just so much work to be done to try and work out where it is and stop its movement, and allow our industry to go forward with as little impact as possible. There will be pain. We have to get through it, and then get back to a more normal business operation for most of the farms, other than those where we actually have the disease.
It keeps coming back to biosecurity, doesn't it? Everywhere in the world, people have talked about the importance of biosecurity, and indeed today we have farms successfully doing business and producing pigs in China, where the disease is rampant, and in Europe, places that have had the disease or countries that have had the disease are continuing to produce where their biosecurity is sound. But where there are breakdowns in biosecurity in a high-risk area, then the disease is a risk. And indeed, the studies from Europe say very clearly that the risk of a farm getting African swine fever is very, very low if their biosecurity is sound.
But we have to see where it is. So while the risk is low, we really can't afford to let it spread from an infected site. Otherwise, it could be very hard to maintain. And that's the problem now, because our movements tend to be to slaughter, so they're going to the same places. We're taking pigs to abattoirs, we're bringing trucks back from abattoirs. That's our risk. But as Ross has said, overseas they've found that it hasn't been that difficult to keep it out of farms.
Okay, Regina, thank you. Yep. Excellent stuff. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. Let me thank once again the sponsors, the Victorian Farmers Federation, Australian Pork Limited, and Agriculture Victoria. People, you're able to view the previous webinars online, and this one will be up soon. Please remember to fill out the exit survey. It's important to us to find out how we've gone today, and it will only take a couple of minutes. Thank you, and good afternoon.